long before he became the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. Dwight David Eisenhower was a quiet and disciplined officer who spent years preparing for a responsibility that few could have imagined. Born in 1890 in the small town of Denison, Texas, Eisenhower grew up in a modest family that valued hard work, education, and perseverance. His childhood was shaped by a strong sense of discipline and cooperation, qualities that would later define his leadership style during the most critical operations of the Second World War. Eisenhower entered the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1911. Although he did not immediately stand out as a battlefield hero, he demonstrated strong organizational skills and a deep interest in military strategy. During his early career, Eisenhower served in various assignments that allowed him to study logistics, planning, and coordination between large military units. These experiences helped him develop a rare ability to manage complex operations involving thousands of soldiers and enormous amounts of equipment. During the First World War, Eisenhower did not fight on the front lines in Europe, but he played an important role in training and organizing American tank units in the United States. While some officers considered such assignments less prestigious, Eisenhower treated them as opportunities to learn. He studied modern warfare carefully, paying close attention to how technology, mobility, and logistics were transforming military strategy. In the years between the world wars, Eisenhower continued building relationships with influential military leaders while refining his understanding of large-scale military planning. When the Second World War erupted, the United States needed commanders who could coordinate enormous Allied forces across multiple nations. Eisenhower's calm leadership, strategic mind, and ability to unite different armies would soon make him the man chosen to lead one of the most ambitious military operations in history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe. During the years between the First and Second World Wars, Dwight D. Eisenhower steadily built the foundation that would later allow him to command one of the largest military alliances in history. Unlike many officers who focused solely on battlefield tactics, Eisenhower developed a deep understanding of how modern wars were organized and fought on a global scale. He studied logistics, communication, and coordination between different branches of the military, elements that were becoming increasingly important as warfare grew more complex. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Eisenhower served in a variety of staff positions where he worked closely with senior commanders. One of the most important influences on his career was his time serving under General Fox Connor, a respected American officer who recognized Eisenhower's potential early on. Connor encouraged him to study military history extensively and introduced him to strategic thinking that went far beyond the tactical level of individual battles. Eisenhower read widely about past conflicts, learning how successful commanders balance resources, alliances, and long-term planning. Later, Eisenhower also worked with General Douglas MacArthur during assignments in Washington and the Philippines. These experiences exposed him to the complexities of international military cooperation and large-scale strategic planning. Although Eisenhower often worked behind the scenes rather than in visible leadership roles, his ability to organize complicated military structures quickly became clear to those around him. By the late 1930s, Europe was once again moving toward war. As tensions increased and military forces across the world began preparing for another global conflict, Eisenhower had quietly developed a reputation as one of the most capable planners in the American Army. His calm personality, strong organizational skills, and ability to work effectively with other leaders would soon make him indispensable. When the United States entered the Second World War, Eisenhower's years of preparation would place him in the center of decisions that would shape the future of the war in Europe. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 dramatically changed the course of American history. Within hours, the United States was drawn fully into the Second World War, transforming a distant conflict into a global struggle that demanded the full mobilization of American industry, military power, and leadership. For the U.S. Army, the sudden entry into war created an urgent need for commanders who could organize enormous forces and coordinate complex operations with allied nations. Among the officers who quickly rose to prominence during this critical moment was Dwight D. Eisenhower. At the time of the attack, Eisenhower was serving in the War Department in Washington. His responsibilities involved planning and organizing large-scale military operations, tasks that required careful coordination between different branches of the armed forces. Within days of the United States entering the war, Eisenhower was deeply involved in discussions about how American forces would join the global fight against the Axis powers. His ability to analyze complicated situations and present clear strategic solutions quickly caught the attention of senior military leaders. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, recognized Eisenhower's extraordinary talent for organization and planning. Marshall understood that modern war required more than battlefield courage. It demanded commanders capable of managing massive coalitions and directing armies across continents. Eisenhower's calm demeanor and ability to work effectively with others made him a natural choice for such responsibilities. Within months, Eisenhower was promoted rapidly and placed in charge of planning major Allied operations. His role expanded far beyond the typical duties of a staff officer. He was now helping design strategies that would determine where and how the United States would fight the war in Europe. The decisions made during these early years of the conflict would ultimately lead to one of the most ambitious military operations ever attempted, the Allied invasion of Western Europe. One of Dwight D. Eisenhower's greatest strengths as a commander was his ability to unite leaders from different nations into a single, coordinated force. The Second World War was not fought by one country alone. The Allied coalition included armies from the United States, Britain, Canada, and many other nations, each with its own traditions, strategies, and political pressures. Bringing these forces together into a unified command structure was an enormous challenge that required diplomacy as much as military skill. Eisenhower quickly proved that he possessed the rare ability to balance these competing interests. Unlike some commanders who focused solely on military authority, Eisenhower understood that cooperation between Allied leaders was essential to victory. He worked closely with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, while maintaining strong relationships with senior military commanders such as General Bernard Montgomery and General George S. Patton. His calm and respectful approach helped prevent disagreements from undermining the Allied war effort. This talent became especially important as Allied leaders began planning large-scale operations against Axis forces in Europe and North Africa. These operations required coordination between naval fleets, air forces, and ground armies drawn from multiple countries. Eisenhower's headquarters became a place where complex strategies were discussed, debated, and refined by officers representing many different nations. Under his leadership, the Allied command structure gradually developed into a powerful and unified military organization. By 1942, Eisenhower had earned the trust of both American and British leaders. His reputation for fairness, patience, and strategic clarity made him the ideal candidate to oversee major multinational operations. The war was expanding rapidly, and Allied forces were preparing to open new fronts against Axis armies. Eisenhower's ability to coordinate these efforts would soon be tested on the battlefields of North Africa, where American troops would face German forces for the first time in the European theater. In November 1942, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of his first major tests as a senior Allied commander. The operation he was responsible for coordinating was known as Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. It would become the first large-scale ground campaign involving American troops against Axis forces in the European theater. The plan required careful coordination between American, British, and Allied naval and air forces across thousands of miles of ocean and coastline. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces for this operation, a role that placed enormous responsibility on his shoulders. Troops would land along several points on the coast of Morocco and Algeria, territories controlled by the Vichy French government. The political situation was complicated, as it was unclear whether local French forces would resist the invasion or cooperate with the Allies. Eisenhower had to balance military strategy with diplomatic considerations, ensuring that the operation could succeed without causing unnecessary conflict with French forces. On November 8, 1942, Allied fleets approached the North African coast under the cover of darkness. Thousands of soldiers prepared to land on unfamiliar beaches, while warships stood ready to provide support if needed. Although some resistance occurred in the early stages of the operation, the Allied landings gradually secured key ports and strategic locations. Within days, large numbers of American troops were moving inland across North Africa. The success of Operation Torch marked a turning point for the United States in the war against Germany. For the first time, American forces were fully engaged in a major campaign alongside their British allies in the European theater. For Eisenhower, the operation proved that he possessed the leadership and organizational skills necessary to coordinate massive multinational military operations. The experience gained during the North African campaign would later become invaluable when planning an even larger and more ambitious invasion, the Allied assault on Nazi-occupied Europe. After the success of Operation Torch, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a new and far more complicated challenge. The Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria had opened a new front against Axis forces in North Africa, but the campaign was far from over. German and Italian armies quickly reinforced their positions in Tunisia, determined to stop the Allied advance before it could fully develop. The rugged hills and narrow valleys of Tunisia created a very different battlefield from the open deserts of Libya and Egypt, and the fighting that followed would test the coordination of the Allied armies. For Eisenhower, the campaign was not simply about directing battles. As Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Mediterranean theater, he had to manage multiple armies from different nations operating across a vast region. British, American, and other Allied units each had their own commanders, supply systems, and tactical approaches. Ensuring that these forces worked together effectively required constant communication and careful planning. The early battles in Tunisia revealed weaknesses in the inexperienced American forces. Some units struggled against the highly trained German army, particularly when facing coordinated attacks by armored divisions. These setbacks created tension within the Allied command structure, as leaders debated how best to reorganize their forces and improve battlefield performance. Eisenhower remained calm during these difficult moments, focusing on strengthening cooperation between Allied commanders rather than assigning blame. Gradually, the Allied armies adapted to the challenge of the campaign. Reinforcements arrived, training improved, and cooperation between British and American units became stronger. Eisenhower's ability to maintain unity among the Allied leadership proved critical during this period. By keeping the coalition together and ensuring that resources were used effectively, he helped guide the campaign toward the final defeat of Axis forces in North Africa, a victory that would open the door for future Allied operations across the Mediterranean and eventually into Europe itself. By the spring of 1943, the long struggle for North Africa was approaching its decisive conclusion. Axis forces, which had once dominated the deserts under the command of General Erwin Rommel, were now trapped in Tunisia between advancing Allied armies. British forces had pushed westward from Egypt and Libya after their victory at El Alamein, while American and Allied troops advanced eastward from Algeria following Operation Torch. The once powerful Axis position in North Africa was steadily collapsing under pressure from both directions. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, This moment represented the culmination of months of complex planning and coordination. As Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the region, he had overseen a massive multinational campaign involving armies from the United States, Britain, and other Allied nations. Ensuring that these different forces worked together effectively had been one of his greatest challenges. Now, as the Allied armies closed in on the remaining Axis positions, the success of that cooperation was becoming clear. The final battles in Tunisia were intense and determined. German and Italian forces fought stubbornly in an attempt to delay the Allied advance and protect routes that might allow their troops to escape across the Mediterranean. Yet, Allied control of the sea and the skies made evacuation nearly impossible. One by one, defensive positions fell as Allied infantry, tanks, and artillery pushed deeper into Axis territory. In May 1943, the North African campaign finally came to an end. Surrounded and cut off from escape, more than 200,000 Axis soldiers were forced to surrender. It was one of the largest Axis defeats of the war up to that point. The victory not only secured North Africa for the Allies, but also opened the Mediterranean for future operations against Italy and Southern Europe. For Eisenhower, the campaign had proven his ability to command large multinational forces, experience that would soon lead to an even greater responsibility in the war against Nazi Germany. After the Allied victory in North Africa, the focus of the war in Europe began to shift toward a far greater objective: the invasion of Nazi occupied Western Europe. Allied leaders understood that defeating Germany would ultimately require a massive assault across the English Channel. Such an operation would demand the coordination of enormous armies, naval fleets, and air forces from multiple nations. The scale of the undertaking was unlike anything attempted in military history. Dwight D. Eisenhower's success in coordinating Allied operations in North Africa had demonstrated that he possessed the rare qualities needed to manage such a complex task. He had shown the ability to work closely with British and American commanders, balance different strategic perspectives, and maintain unity among the Allied leadership. Because of these qualities, Eisenhower soon became the central figure in planning the next stage of the war against Germany. During 1943, Allied planners began gathering vast resources in Britain for the future invasion of Europe. Soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations were transported across the Atlantic in enormous numbers. Military bases across the British Isles filled with troops, tanks, aircraft, and supply depots. Engineers and logisticians worked tirelessly to prepare specialized landing craft and equipment designed to deliver entire armies onto heavily defended beaches. The planning process itself was extraordinarily complex. Commanders had to consider weather conditions, tides, enemy defenses, transportation routes, and the coordination of air and naval support. Every detail could influence the success or failure of the operation. Eisenhower played a crucial role in overseeing these preparations, ensuring that the many different elements of the Allied war machine worked together as a unified force. The invasion of Europe would require patience, precision, and leadership on a scale never before seen in modern warfare. In December 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower received the appointment that would define his place in history. Allied leaders selected him to serve as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, placing him in charge of the massive military operation that would invade Nazi-occupied Western Europe. The mission, known as Operation Overlord, would require the coordination of millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, and countless aircraft. Eisenhower now carried the responsibility for one of the most ambitious military campaigns ever planned. The decision to appoint Eisenhower was based on more than his strategic abilities. Allied leaders recognized that the invasion required a commander who could manage complex relationships between different nations and their military leaders. The Allied coalition included powerful personalities and experienced commanders, each with their own ideas about how the war should be fought. Eisenhower's calm demeanor and diplomatic skill made him uniquely suited to maintain unity among these leaders while guiding the enormous operation toward its goal. From his headquarters in Britain, Eisenhower worked closely with senior commanders responsible for the various elements of the invasion. British General Bernard Montgomery was tasked with commanding the ground forces during the initial stages of the landings. Naval commanders organized the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled, while air forces prepared to dominate the skies over northern France. Every branch of the Allied military contributed to the planning process, and Eisenhower stood at the center of this vast network of coordination. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. The success of Operation Overlord would determine whether the Allies could establish a foothold in Western Europe and begin the final campaign against Nazi Germany. Failure could result in catastrophic losses and prolong the war indefinitely. Eisenhower understood the stakes better than anyone. Yet despite the pressure, he remained focused on preparation and unity, ensuring that the Allied forces would be ready when the moment finally arrived to launch the invasion of Europe. By the spring of 1944, the preparations for Operation Overlord had reached their final stages. Across southern England, Allied forces had gathered in enormous numbers, waiting for the moment when the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would begin. Soldiers trained for amphibious landings, aircraft crews prepared for airborne missions, and naval fleets assembled in harbors along the English coast. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, and every element had to be carefully coordinated. Yet one critical factor remained beyond the control of any commander: the weather. The invasion required precise conditions. Landing craft needed relatively calm seas. Aircraft required clear visibility, and airborne troops had to navigate the night skies accurately. Meteorologists studied weather patterns across the English Channel, searching for a narrow window that would allow the massive operation to proceed. Several possible dates were considered, but changing weather conditions forced Eisenhower and his commanders to delay the launch of the invasion. On the evening of June 4th, 1944, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders to review the latest weather reports. The situation was uncertain. Stormy conditions across the channel threatened to disrupt the carefully planned landings. Yet meteorologists predicted a brief break in the weather on June 6th. Waiting longer might allow the Germans more time to strengthen their defenses or detect the Allied preparations. The decision now rested entirely with Eisenhower. After listening to the reports and considering the risks, he made the final choice that would send thousands of ships and aircraft toward the coast of France. In the early hours of June 5th, he gave the order that would launch one of the most significant military operations in history. The invasion would proceed with a simple command: "Okay, let's go." Eisenhower set in motion the events that would change the course of the war in Europe. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began. Across the English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled moved steadily toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. Thousands of ships carried Allied soldiers toward the beaches of Normandy, while aircraft filled the skies above the channel. Paratroopers were already descending behind enemy lines, tasked with securing key bridges, roads, and defensive positions before the main landings began. The long-planned invasion of Western Europe was finally underway. Dwight D. Eisenhower remained at Allied headquarters in England, closely monitoring the unfolding operation. From there, he coordinated reports arriving from naval commanders, Air Force units, and ground forces preparing to land on the beaches. Every stage of the invasion depended on precise timing and cooperation between different branches of the Allied military. Eisenhower understood that once the operation began, events in the battlefield would quickly take on a life of their own. Along the Normandy coast, German defenses were caught by surprise as waves of Allied forces approached. Naval guns opened fire on coastal fortifications, while aircraft bombed defensive positions. Soon after, landing craft carrying American, British, and Canadian soldiers began moving toward 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Each beach presented different challenges, and fierce resistance from German defenders turned some landing zones to scenes of intense combat. Despite the chaos and danger, Allied forces gradually established footholds along the coast. Soldiers pushed inland, securing villages, roads, and strategic positions that would allow reinforcements to continue landing. For Eisenhower, the success of the first day of the invasion was a crucial step toward the liberation of Europe. The battle for Normandy had begun, and the Allied armies were finally returning to the continent to challenge Nazi Germany directly. Although the landings on June 6th had succeeded in establishing a foothold in France, the struggle for Normandy had only just begun. German forces quickly organized strong defensive positions inland, determined to prevent the Allies from expanding their beachheads. The landscape of Normandy presented its own challenges. Thick hedgerows, narrow country roads, and fortified villages created a complex battlefield that slowed the Allied advance and favored defensive tactics. For Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Allied command, the next objective was clear: break out of the narrow coastal areas and push deeper into France before German reinforcements could fully stabilize the front. Achieving this goal required careful coordination between the different Allied armies operating across the region. British and Canadian forces fought to secure territory on the eastern side of the invasion area, while American forces advanced through the difficult hedgerow countryside to the west. The fighting during the Normandy campaign was intense and often exhausting for the soldiers on the ground. Each field, village, and road junction could become the site of fierce battles as German units attempted to slow the Allied advance. Tanks maneuvered through narrow lanes, while infantry units cleared defensive positions one by one. Artillery and air support played a crucial role in weakening German defenses and opening paths for further advances. Throughout this difficult campaign, Eisenhower remained focused on maintaining coordination among the Allied forces. His leadership ensured that British, American, and Canadian armies continued working together despite the enormous challenge of the battlefield. As weeks passed, the Allies gradually expanded their control over Normandy, preparing for the moment when their armies would finally break through the German lines and begin the liberation of France. By late July 1944, after weeks of intense fighting in Normandy, the Allied armies were finally ready to break through the German defensive lines. The narrow hedgerow fields that had slowed the advance for so long had turned the early stages of the campaign into a brutal war of attrition. Yet Allied commanders understood that once the German defenses were broken, their superior numbers, air power, and mobility could transform the battlefield entirely. The breakthrough came with Operation Cobra, a massive offensive led by American forces west of St. Lo. Allied bombers launched a powerful aerial bombardment against German defensive positions, weakening their lines and creating the opportunity for ground forces to advance. When the attack began, American armored units pushed rapidly through the shattered German defenses, opening a gap in the front that allowed Allied forces to surge forward. As the breakthrough expanded, the war in France quickly shifted from slow, grinding combat to rapid maneuver warfare. Allied tanks and mechanized infantry raced across the countryside, liberating towns and cities that had endured years of German occupation. Civilians emerged from their homes to welcome the advancing soldiers, celebrating the arrival of the forces that had come to free their country. For Dwight D. Eisenhower, the success of the breakout confirmed that the invasion of Normandy had achieved its strategic objective. The Allied armies were no longer confined to the beaches of northern France. Instead, they were now advancing across Western Europe toward the borders of Germany itself. The liberation of France had begun, and the momentum of the Allied advance was becoming increasingly difficult for the German army to stop. By the beginning of 1945, the Allied armies had advanced across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, pushing steadily toward the heart of Nazi Germany. The once powerful German military machine was now under enormous pressure from multiple directions. In the West, the armies under Dwight D. Eisenhower's command were approaching the Rhine River, one of the last major natural barriers protecting the German homeland. At the same time, Soviet forces were advancing from the east, closing in on Berlin. The final months of the war in Europe were marked by intense battles as German forces attempted to delay the inevitable Allied advance. Cities, bridges, and defensive lines were fiercely contested as the German army struggled to defend its territory. Yet by this stage of the war, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Allied air forces dominated the skies, while their armies possessed overwhelming numbers of troops, tanks, and artillery. One of the most important moments of this phase came when Allied forces successfully crossed the Rhine River in March 1945. The crossing opened the door for a rapid advance deep into Germany. Armored divisions and infantry units pushed forward across the country, capturing strategic cities and cutting off remaining German formations. Throughout these operations, Eisenhower remained focused on maintaining coordination between the many Allied armies under his command. His leadership ensured that American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces continued to operate together as a unified force. As the Allied armies advanced across Germany, it became increasingly clear that the end of the war in Europe was approaching. In May 1945, the war in Europe finally came to an end. After nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allied forces. Across the continent, cities that had endured years of occupation and destruction began to celebrate the long-awaited return of peace. For the soldiers who had fought across beaches, forests, mountains, and rivers, the victory represented the end of an extraordinary and exhausting struggle. At the center of the Allied war effort in Western Europe stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, he had overseen the planning and execution of the largest amphibious invasion in history and coordinated the massive armies that advanced across Europe after the success of D-Day. His leadership required not only military skill, but also diplomacy, patience, and the ability to unite commanders from many different nations into a single coordinated force. Eisenhower's approach to leadership was often calm and methodical. He understood that modern warfare required cooperation on an enormous scale. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships and aircraft, and vast networks of supply lines all had to function together with precision. By maintaining unity among the Allied commanders and ensuring that strategic goals remained clear, Eisenhower helped guide the Allied coalition toward victory. After the war, Eisenhower's reputation as one of the most important commanders of the conflict remained firmly established. The success of Operation Overlord and the liberation of Western Europe had reshaped the course of the war and demonstrated the power of cooperation between Allied nations. The man who had once quietly studied military strategy in staff offices had become the commander who led the forces that returned to Europe and helped bring the Second World War to its end.